I did a show on Saturday. It was my first show since 2019. And someone showed up that I didn't recognize visually, but he came up to me, told me his name, and I was like, oh, you're that guy. Like, I've seen your name a million times. And he just was like, yeah, like 3 years ago, I commented on one of your videos and you replied. And I always remembered. And
wow,
like, that's all it took. So like you got to think about that is like, you are actually leaving money on the table every time you avoid that kind of thing.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by Indiepreneur.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. This is episode 188, and I am your co-host, Jack McCarthy. With me, as always, is my co-pilot, Mr. Ed Isola. Ed, what's going on, dude?
Not very much. Actually, quite a lot, but I'm excited to have an afternoon to dive into today's topic with you all.
Me too, man. And I'd like to just introduce here our esteemed guest for today's episode, Mr. the most basic printer of all printers, the Indie founder, coach, and IndieX account manager, Mr. Jesse Gillen-Walters. Jesse, what's up, dude? Thanks for being here, man.
Hey, thank you for inviting me on. I don't want to spoil, but this topic, or maybe Ed already spoiled it. The point being, I'm excited for the topic, and I'm honored that you thought of me.
I think that this is going to be a blast of an episode, and I couldn't think of a better person to come on to talk about it. I want to share what kind of inspired even getting into this episode at all. But we're going to be talking about talking to your fans online and kind of specifically get into like email marketing stuff, which is something that a lot of artists, I feel like, get squeamish about. I've certainly had plenty of conversations where people have been like, oh, I don't know how to say the things that I want to say, or I don't want to say anything at all. And I thought it would be really fun for the three of us to just kind of get into a deep dive of how to actually do this, talk to your fans effectively in a way that feels, on brand and authentic and real to who you are as an artist and a human being, and why kind of all that matters. But yeah, man, I'm stoked to have you here. I think it's going to be a lot of fun. What's been up? It's been a while since you've been on the show. What have you been working on?
Yeah, well, I moved, and so that threw a wrench in some of my regular marketing. But actually, in a weird, relevant kind of way, I've been able to lean more into email marketing because I've kind of paused my ad type stuff, and it's been more about just working my warm audience. And so it's been kind of a reminder in pausing these more active, daily, kind of more volatile pushes through ads. I've been able to remember, like, I have this list that, is worth nurturing and will feedback positively. And it's pretty easy to just send an email every so often, a week or every other week, keep them going. So that's kind of where I've been.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because that's actually exactly what sort of inspired me to chat with Ed and be like, yo, we should have Jesse on to talk about, email marketing and talking to fans, because it was your email to your fans. I'm on your list, in case you didn't know. I'm on your list, and it was your email to your fans about buying your house and moving in and how vulnerable it was. That kind of was like, man, like, Jesse is really, really good at talking to his people. And I think it's, like I said, I think it's something that a lot of artists struggle with. So I'm glad that you mentioned that, moving was kind of the catalyst for, changing up some of your marketing efforts right now and focusing more on email. I would love to just dive right into like that moment and why you wanted to talk to your fans like that. And then I'd love to unpack just like how you've become so comfortable being vulnerable with people and telling the stories of what you're up to and kind of how that applies to you as an artist and why it makes sense.
Cool. Yeah, it's funny because that email definitely felt like it was definitely something I toiled over and was very delicate about. It was something I thought about a lot before sending, and I actually sent it to a few people to like look over it, which I never really do.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. So to explain kind of what had gone on, like, yeah, I moved into this new house, bought a house, big moment, a lot of, again, volatility, which kind of caused me to do a few things marketing wise. First of all, it was kind of shut off my higher spend ads for the moment while I kind of transition. But then also, I have all this merch that I don't want to move, So perfect time for a clear, kind of a closeout sale. Perfect occasion to tie into something like that where it's like, look, I don't want to move this stuff. I want to, and I also am buying a house. So, if you want to support me in that, also contributing to this clear out sale makes sense. So there's a lot of things that tie in together around this moment that made sense for me to kind of hone in on it. Now, the way I kind of presented this email was very long. It was kind of longer than normal. I think the subject line was like, this is the most personal email I will probably ever send, or something like that. And I open up in the email talking about, like, look, to be totally honest with you all, I've never profited from my music. Now, sidebar to that is true. However, I have grown at a slight loss exponentially year over year since 2017. I'm now basicpreneur.
Right.
It is now like a, 5-figure kind of business, which is cool, at a very small loss comparative to the kind of the revenue. While it is true that I'm not like rolling in it, what I didn't come out and say is like, the innate value of this business has grown. However, I have not, profited in terms of cash.
You're not taking distributions. Yeah.
Yeah. So, it's this long drawn out email about, the fact that I was able to get to this point, the fact that I was able to have both. I was able to be financially in a position to buy a house as well as grow my music, which is a risky thing that people are usually put out by. Like, usually they're like, I can buy a house and pursuing music. What do you think I'm going to be able to do? So I kind of talk about that. Like, you have fed back to this so much that I'm able to have both. And now moving into this house, like, I can make things better and more frequently now. So that was kind of the vibe of the email. And then I mentioned that, so I'm doing a clearance sale. And so, yeah, I was very kind of feeble about it and kind of coy about it, I guess you could say. And part of that desire to have that voice kind of just tied into like how I've been treating them all this while. I've always come to them with kind of plain text, literally lowercase emails saying, hey, this is what's going on. To be honest, I don't feel great this week. Here's explicitly why that is. Like, I've been super open about them the whole time. So another thing is just consistency. Like, if I came in and had anything that wasn't just vulnerable and real, it would have been like jarring. Now, I'm going to let Ed and you talk a little bit more, respond. But the last thing I'll say is, the funniest thing is I told over this email so much, and then I realized, like, rappers and other, there's people in other genres of music who, like, if they bought a house, they would be, like, bragging about it, and everyone would be, like, pumped about it. And here I am being like, how do I talk about this?
Yeah. That's so interesting. I didn't even think about that.
I think one thing, Jesse, is like, we're talking about, okay, you just sent an email about buying a house, and like, you're like, oh, their fans would presumably react a different way. I think like where it all starts though is that I'm assuming, but you're being authentic with who you are. So I guess my question is like, have you always been transparent with your email subscribers since they've started in 2017 coming onto your list?
Oh, absolutely. Like, and even the way they came onto the list, I kind of set the precedent of vulnerability and openness, like with my album launch in 2017, where I really grew the list. That whole launch was about like, kind of the nitty gritty of this, the songs that the album launch was relating to, and the personal, things that happened to me that, created those songs or inspired those songs. And there was often names and places and dates and things that were coming up. And I've kind of always carried that through, not just the marketing, but like the music, like being very literal and very real. So for sure.
I think that's something to underline, because it's like, you can send an email about you know, buying a house, or if you're having a bad week, because you've been so just kind of like authentic with your supporters so far. And I think that's something that a lot of artists shy away from. And kind of the point of talking about this today is to say, no, it's cool to be authentic, you know? I think that's a really key thing for people that are listening to take away from today's episode as we dive into it.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think it's interesting that you mentioned how, you know, when people were first coming onto your list, whether it was from your first album launch or your second, in your marketing campaigns, you were kind of baking in this expectation of like, this is how I'm going to communicate with you. Like, this is how you can expect to hear from me in a channel like email. And I know, you know, there's different ways to communicate with different fans depending on where they are, whether it's on socials or whether it's in email or text or whatever it might be. But it's interesting that you started setting that precedent. I want to link back to in the show notes to, I think it was either the last time or the time before that you were on the show talking about your album launch, your more recent album launch, because I think that would give some insight into that. Why was that? So something that I want to start to unpack, like what Ed was saying about how important that is, and how a lot of artists tend to shy away from, you know, being open and vulnerable, or not even necessarily vulnerable, but wanting to tell their fans stories of what's going on in their life. Why was that, you know, for you as an artist, like, why was that so important to you? Like, why does that matter to who you are as a human, you know?
Yeah. Well, I think part of it was just a functional decision, right? Like, the music that I'm making is also not hiding as much, you know? I'm not making like this super sleek, overproduced kind of, you know, vapid sort of statement in my music typically. So it just made sense, again, functionally, that it would be like, how would I talk about this music? It's like, well, I'd be a little, you know, quirky and honest and funny about it, ideally. So there's that. But like in doing that, I kind of discovered like, you know, if you set that precedent and you have the door wide open, there's just more of a chance that people will come in, if that makes any sense.
It totally makes sense. And I'm curious what you guys think about this. Like, I'm going to make a statement that might seem a little harsh, but I'm going to just kind of put it out there and hopefully it lands okay. But, you know, I think there's often a mindset that comes from a lot of artists and musicians that I've met, you know, over the years of like, oh, I want to be like the mysterious artist, especially artists that come from making music that is deeply personal. It's like they pour their heart and soul into the music and writing the lyrics or whatever, and then they kind of want to be mysterious online and not show their face, or, you know, not email their fans, not really talk about what's going on. And it's almost, that's counterintuitive to me when you're making that kind of music, as opposed to like, you know, people might consider like hip hop music or pop music, you know, stuff that kind of might not carry a message that's deeply personal to the artist that's singing the song. You know, that's probably like a light way of putting it. I love pop music. I love hip hop music. So I don't have any personal judgments against the people writing those, certainly, but other people might. But it's often those artists that you see, you know, doing a little more to connect with their fans. Going back to what you said about like a hip hop artist, a rapper might be like showing off their giant new mansion in a music video, you know? It's like opposite ideas here. And I kind of think it's dumb. So like that was the harsh point that I wanted to make. Like, I kind of think it's dumb.
I think that maybe people pull the idea of wanting to be mysterious from acts that they watched growing up. And I think a lot of it stems from the fact that traditionally email marketing and openness is not something that previously has been preached, I guess, in the music industry. So now you hear us talking about, oh, you should just be authentic and email about whatever, you know, and just communicate with people like they're your friends and actually focus on building that relationship. I think it's a little bit of a paradigm shift where it goes from, oh, okay, my favorite artist never sent me a single email, so I'm going to just replicate what I've seen, into like, hey, you should do the complete opposite. But on that note, so I agree, I think it's stupid. But on the other hand, it's like there's huge artists that have taken to communicating with their fans. Like, I mean, Taylor Swift comes to mind. You know, she goes out of her way to talk to people and invite people over to her house to like premiere albums for them, and she like goes that extra length for that fan engagement. And obviously she's huge, but people love her for it. And I'm sure there's handfuls of bigger artists that go out of their way to talk to people, and that just endears people even more. So I think that whole idea of, oh, if I'm mysterious, people are going to dig me, I think that's just kind of misguided based off of, you know, poor practices in the past.
Yeah, I totally agree. I mean, I think misguided is a good word for it. Like, I'm not meaning to call anybody in particular dumb if you feel that way, but I do think it's kind of silly in the sense that, like, if you write deeply personal music, I would want to, you know, encourage you to extend your marketing creativity to also be deeply personal, you know? And I think what you said is totally true, Ed, about like it being a little misguided, and maybe, you know, maybe technology and like social and culture has kind of moved us in this direction. I mean, I would say it definitely has moved us in this direction of like being open and transparent with, you know, the people that are surrounding you, whether you're a brand or an artist or a producer or whatever it might be. Humans are more interconnected now than they ever have been, thanks to the internet.
I think it's also about like range, you know, if you are so buttoned up and so minimal and so one way about everything in your emails anyway, you can't do anything else without it feeling weird or off. Like if you build your whole fan base on being like super reserved and sending super infrequently and not really talking about kind of the why or the how behind things, then if you were to all of a sudden do that, it would feel so weird and kind of wrong. Whereas if you start the other direction, you have more range to work with from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. Something that comes to mind on this kind of front of being mysterious is when artists are like, hey, I want to disappear from email and social media for, you know, a month or 2 months, right? And I think that there are instances where that's cool, but I think what makes that cool, like you just said, is starting off by talking to people and being open, so that if you're going to go into this down period or this dark period of a month, you could kind of preface it by saying, hey, I'm heading into this month where I'm doing A, B, and C, so you're not going to hear from me. And like, you're still letting them into your world. And then when you come back, you can kind of tell them about what's going on. But like starting really open allows for more opportunity, like you just said, Jesse, versus if you're not talking to anybody and then you say, you know, like imagine you don't talk to anybody, you don't send any emails, and then you say, hey, you're not going to get any emails from me for the next month. It's like, no one's going to care, you know?
I didn't think I was getting any anyway.
Yeah, it's like, cool, good story, dude. But I mean, I think it's really cool to be open with people. And I think the balance is like, how do you actually talk to your fans, and how do you go about maybe not oversharing? Because you probably have people on one spectrum that are not going to send any emails, and then you have people on the other spectrum that are going to say, hey, I had cereal for breakfast this morning. So I think that's an interesting thing to kind of unpack as well, is how do you balance what's shareable information?
Yeah, I'd be curious to know your thoughts on this, Jesse. I mean, in particular, like you've coached hundreds of artists at this point, and I'm sure that this has come up. Like, how do you strike that balance between like storytelling and not becoming like Ed was saying, like, here's what I ate for breakfast kind of communicator?
Yeah. Well, I think there's one binary I might want to break apart that may help kind of explain this, which is that you can be mysterious and vulnerable simultaneously, or mysterious and, you know, open simultaneously. Like, you know, you can let people in a little bit at a time, and let in more than other artists would, but it doesn't have to be like all out there all at once all the time, which I am probably more all out there all at once all the time, but there's definitely a solution that involves retaining that kind of mysteriousness. And I think, like, for example, just one artist that comes to mind that does this pretty solidly, at least on social, is James Blake. He definitely seems like a very mysterious, like in the shadows, kind of in the background kind of guy. But lately with his singles that he's been putting out, he's been just in a few lines on a Facebook post will be like, man, this song really freaked me out to write. I hope you love it. Just a little bit more than like, not, you know, more than out now, go check it out. Like it feels like he's writing it, you know, and is touching on kind of the meanings of songs and things. So when people, you know, when artists want to have that sense of mysteriousness, it's like, okay, well, that doesn't mean it's at 100% of the expense of being open. And so what I tell people is like, what I tell, you know, artists that I'm coaching, it's like, if you kind of want your email to be almost the gift of your email list is accessing that vulnerability, even if it's 5% more. But if you join, and you know, we've done that, we've seen this a million times, like they're big artists you like, and all of their social posts are, this is out now, this is out now. Like, I don't get anything. It's pretty much just a billboard for who I already know they are. Then you join their list and you don't get any emails except for when something else is out now. And it's just like, I gain nothing. I gain nothing from being on this list. So you could, you know, even if you were never going to engage in that email list, you know, clicking on anything, if you were never going to follow a link in an email, if you open an email from an artist and you get something that's a little bit more tailored and direct, that should model to your fan, like, okay, if I go deeper, I get more. And I think that's really that simple.
It's crazy for me to hear you say, like, yes, this guy shared an Instagram post that says, you know, it scared me to write this song. And that is one step further than 90% of artists will go, which is just wild, but also really low-hanging fruit if you're listening to just like go share a one-line, you know, quote unquote, insightful Instagram post and be doing more than everybody else all of a sudden.
Oh my God.
You know, it's like such a low barrier to entry to do a good job on this connection.
I know that's totally something, like, I know I've heard you saying it on calls with some of our IndieX clients, Ed. I've definitely said the same thing, is like, from a nurturing perspective, when it comes to emails and talking to your fans, like, it doesn't have to be crazy. It doesn't have to be super long and drawn out. It just needs to be like a little bit open. I know you're really like tuned into that with the 502s. But it's definitely something that comes up, you know, from time to time, just working with artists.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's such a good point.
And I feel like now we're getting into it, right? Like Jesse had a good point earlier where he says, you kind of said, you switched from using the word vulnerable into using the word open, which I think is a good distinction. Because I think if people hear, oh, be vulnerable in your emails, they might just be like, hey, I got dumped last night, which honestly might be a good nurturing email, but you don't need to overshare it.
Ooh, my people would love that.
Yeah, right. So it depends. But it's like, you don't have to be like oversharing and just like pouring your soul out. I think being open is a good way to think about it. At the same time, you were kind of leading into the idea that, oh, as somebody gets deeper into your ecosystem, you should be more and more open with them. And that, I think, speaks to the buddy system, where it's like, it's a relationship. You don't go on a first date and just like, you know, dump all your baggage onto somebody and expect to ever see them again. And I think that really works the same way with fans, where it's like you want to little by little get to know them and talk to them, and then it's going to seem really inauthentic if you send an email to somebody as soon as they sign up, like, thank you so much for, you know, like being on this journey and like supporting me. It's like, okay, I just found out who you were like 25 minutes ago, you know? So I think, I think that idea that Jesse was getting into of like, I don't know what you call it, but more and more openness as you get deeper into the relationship is really, really important to kind of highlight.
Yeah. I mean, what that's making me think about now is like, again, like as you get further down the buddy system, you want to be more open. I think the other side of that is, or rather something that comes in tow with that, is that not only do I find that to be the case, but that if you are an independent musician with a small to growing fan base and you have full control of your marketing, you are probably behooved to do that because it's your competitive advantage over like Billie Eilish. Like in a day-to-day basis, I don't have access to Billie Eilish. Do you know what I mean? And so a fan doesn't even have it in their mind like, oh, I could go to a house show with Billie Eilish, you know? But you can offer that. You can offer intensely like interpersonal one-on-one in the same room or in the same Zoom kind of things. Like you could wake up one day and rig something like that up and make that happen. And you just have immediate access to that kind of intensely valuable thing for people.
Gosh, that is such a good point. In the phrase competitive advantage, I feel like a lot of times you hear people say like, well, I can't compete with so-and-so, you know, like you just said, Billie Eilish, I can't compete with her. She's massive. And it's like, well, actually, you just have to play to your strengths a little bit more. And it's not an easy thing to realize in the moment, but I think highlighting that is just, I was just like, dang, that's a great point. Because it's like you can compete, but you got to kind of set your own rules. Like you said, okay, you can go do a house concert or you can do one-on-one Zoom chats with like every fan over the course of a day. Like at one time, I think we were like, hey, submit your phone numbers and we'll call you and just say what's up and Merry Christmas, you know? And we called like 50 people and we put it on Facebook Live. And what's cool is that doing that, like whether it's whatever it is, doing that like one-on-one, hand-to-hand communication, that actually sets the groundwork I'm seeing now for 3 years down the road when you need bigger asks, or as you get bigger, now people that you talk to when you were just starting out and had no real fan base, they're like, wow, I talked to them on the phone one time, you know, and it's like, okay, who cares, you know, like your point of view as the artist is probably like, I'm just a dude playing a guitar, but to your fans, it's like letting them into your world as early as you can. As your journey goes on, it becomes more and more valuable and makes that relationship more and more solidified.
I totally agree. It's competitive advantage. That's such an interesting concept because like you don't hear it applied that way. People, like you said, Ed, like people say like, oh, you know, I can't compete with XYZ artists. Like they have a massive label marketing budget and stuff like that. But when it comes to creating fans that stick, like this kind of communication, intimacy, openness, vulnerability, whatever you want to call it, and whatever like, you know, part of the spectrum you live on as a communicator, as an artist, whatever you fall on, whether it's like, you know, really, really open and vulnerable and, you know, long emails that happen, you know, once a week or twice a week or whatever it might be, or whether it's, you know, more on the James Blake side of things where it doesn't seem that intimate, but then you're starting to kind of see it trickle out here in like the social posts. Like wherever you fall in that, that's really where like the competitive advantage lies, and the ability to create fans that stick with you and that like all of a sudden you've become a moment in their life. Like, and I mean like a moment in like the sense of like a, something that they will remember. Not something that just passes by when they, you know, see your new track on Spotify or something like that.
Like, okay, so I did a show on Saturday. It was my first show since 2019. And someone showed up that I didn't recognize visually, but he came up to me, told me his name, and I was like, oh, you're that guy. Like, I've seen your name a million times. And he just was like, yeah, you know, like 3 years ago, I commented on one of your videos and you replied. And I always remembered. And
wow,
like that's all it took. You know, so like you got to think about that, is like you are actually leaving money on the table every time you avoid that kind of thing. Like that was a ticket sale 3 years later, and you know, he came to that show as someone in that venue 3 years later, and I didn't know I was investing in it. And it's like my goal is to never be desensitized to gaining a fan. Like I remember when I was making music when I was 18 being like, I will probably never have a real fan, like having that thought, and then learning how to get them. And I'm never not excited when I get like a new positive comment or a message or a new order or something. And it's like, not only, you know, do I think having that attitude is ultimately beneficial for everyone involved, but But I would also say I don't think you can afford to not be that way if you're independent.
100%.
Yeah, I mean, I think you can't afford to be that way whether you're independent or not.
Actually, that's a good point.
Realistically, like the way that culture and the world is going, I think more and more like that interconnectedness that artists and fans and really any kind of public figures feel with the people that support them or surround them, whatever you want to call it. Like, I think that's going to become more and more critical as time goes on for separating like the people that create businesses and the people that have like, you know, flash in the pan moments.
Yeah, dude, that's exactly what I was about to touch on, was like, you kind of just said like, if whether you're big or small as an artist, you can't afford to not talk to your fans. And I think kind of like an additional point to that is that if you're a big artist, you know, or even medium sized, financially, you might be able to get away with not talking to your fans. But what you're sacrificing if you don't talk to people is the longevity of your career. So there's a lot of talk around like TikTok and going viral and that kind of stuff. And I would venture to guess that in 20 years, the people that went viral and kind of just like flash in the pan created this career for themselves, the people that are going to stick around and actually be able to continue to tour and play music and sell merch are the people that took the time to talk to the fans, engage with them, get them into an email list or a text message list. Like, if you don't do that and you're just like, oh, how do I keep going viral, or how do I keep getting more attention on myself, and you never stop to collect the people and like talk to them from one location, I think, you know, you leave a lot of longevity on the table, and you probably won't be doing music in 20 years if you don't actually talk to people.
Yeah, that's actually, that's really what it's about. It's like the super intense nurturing, the tempering that each interaction just secures in the long run.
Yeah.
And I think it's like when you get into paid traffic and marketing proper and stuff like that, for me anyway, it engendered even more gratitude. It was like, if I spent money to acquire someone, it's like, oh my gosh, you made it. Like, I made this happen. You like, you know, and it's like, I hope you don't unsubscribe now. I went through so much to get you here, you know?
Yeah. Well, it's crazy because I'm thinking about, you know, you just said that you had somebody come out to your show, and I was like, dang, you know what? I had a very similar experience a couple weeks ago when we did our first album launch in like 2017 or 18, whenever it was. Somebody, you know, we'll call him, for the purpose of, you know, Jack's on the call, we'll call him Jack. But this guy had sent us like 2 emails and bought a CD, and I'd never met him before. And one of the other guys in the band was like, hey, you know, Jack is here in the crowd, and he says he was a part of the party. And I was like, oh, Jack McCarthy? And I just knew his name via email, and then I went and talked to him. And it's like, it's crazy. And I think that's such a thing where, like, you just said it, Jesse, don't be desensitized to creating fans and people. Like, you should never be that jaded. If you're the one responsible for connecting with people, you should never be like, I don't care about you. You know, like, it's more of a like, holy cow, you know, like at this point, there's a couple thousand people probably on your email list, Jesse, and you could probably sit down and list, you know, a good portion of them, or at least recognize their names, which is just incredible.
Jack, before I pass it off to you, like, that actually is such an interesting thought experiment to me. Like, what if you give me 10 minutes to just literally list off as many fans as I could? I don't think I could. I think I would not run out of names after 10 minutes. I think I could just go for so long.
It's so funny that you say that, because I'm pretty sure recently Ed said one of the same, like something exactly the same to me. He was like, oh yeah, like, I know a lot of our fans just from emailing back and forth with them. Like, that's the kind of relationship that I've gotten to know, gotten to have with them. And I've seen similar with like a lot of our IndieX clients that we work with, you know, working on their email marketing and getting to tap into like some of the way that they communicate, you know, like personally with their fans, because there's plenty of times where it's like, hey, we're going to strike up, you know, an email campaign or a series of automations or something like that. And we get to kind of get in the get into the nitty gritty of writing from their heart, from their brain, and then letting them kind of fill in the gaps where you don't quite get the voicing, because that's always going to be special. And that comes up all the time too. It's like, oh yeah, like we sent this email and like XYZ person immediately emailed me back, and like, they're a crazy fan and they're always responding to my emails. Like that kind of thing happens all the time.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And here's another point too, that like in favor of actually talking to people, especially if you're early on, or if you're at a point in your career where you're like, okay, how do I take the next step? You've kind of plateaued. Actually, something I've found for myself is actually communicating with our fans has taught me, one, how our fans talk, right? Like that's super important when it comes to advertising and emails and that kind of stuff. And two, like what they want. So like if you're not talking to people, you're just shooting in the dark with your language and with your offers, and you have no clue. But if you do that hand-to-hand combat, like just by simple conversations, you're like, oh, you know what? So-and-so would like this. We should explore that. And it's like not intentional, but just a byproduct of nurturing.
There's like a feedback loop that starts to happen. Like by communicating with your fans regularly and in an open way that makes sense to you, you start to learn like what the tribal language of your base is. And then it creates this feedback loop of like, they're communicating back this way, we should lean more into this, or like, oh, I won't ever say it like that again, like it pissed people off, that kind of thing. And then it opens you up more and more to learn like, this is how I should do it, and here's where I want to pull back, and here's where it makes sense to pull back. Or like, if I want to go dark for a week, like here's the place where I should do it, and here's the place where I shouldn't, because I don't want to neglect these people. And you start to see like all these different pieces of not only your fan base ecosystem, but also just your marketing stack in general, like where you can be doing things, how you can be doing them, how you can be saying them, so on and so forth. That's such a good point.
And on top of that, I think the more you talk to people, like if you're talking to 100 individual subscribers and you're the one common point for all those people, not only are you learning how they talk, they're learning how you speak. And then now you're kind of putting this common language and phrasing that you use in front of all your subscribers at once. And it, like you said, just becomes this feedback loop where like, it's authentic, going back to Jesse's first point, and it's authentic, and you don't have to overthink it. You don't have to sit and think like, oh, how would I say this? What sounds good? It's like, here's what I think. Here's, unless you're super crude, maybe that's your brand. I don't know. But it's like, you can just be yourself, and then you're kind of off to the races with being able to really grow your brand.
What I think is really hysterical is like big companies are dying for your opinion as their customer. Like IKEA yesterday sent me an email being like, it's the classic thing where you get a survey, like you get an email post-purchase and they're like, could you please give us, 2 minutes of your time? It's like pulling teeth to them, like, please fill out this survey, please. And then you open it and it's like, in this case, there was a text field and they were like, please be as detailed and open as possible. And there's like a reason that companies are dying for their customers' opinions is because they want qualitative data. And every time you don't try, either don't coax responses or don't leave yourself open for responses or ignore responses, you are basically shooting yourself in the foot. Like those are free survey responses. To an artist, that should, that's essentially, not to totally reduce it. Obviously, it's much more personal, interpersonal, and much more special. But if you're speaking purely as a marketer, it's just like you are just crumpling up survey responses and turning them away. And that is worth money to big companies all the time.
Well, you pretty much said never ignore responses. And I had written down a note here that was like, we're talking about how to talk to your fans, but I think another good thing is, when do you talk to your fans? And the answer is, always, but never. I mean, I to this day, I don't let a Facebook or Instagram comment or TikTok comment or, an email or YouTube comment. Everything gets a heart and everything gets some kind of response, even if it's a flame emoji, like it's just like you have to, and it's not that crazy of a time investment. But like you said, if you're not talking to people, then you're ignoring them and you're taking their input and crumpling it up, like you said. And that's super detrimental to a independent artist as you're growing, or as you're trying to, monetize or get more email subscribers. It's just like a huge can't have. You got to talk to people.
And music makes such a big impact on people's lives, like it's emotional. It's part of, it's for me and for many others, and I'm sure you guys would agree with this as well in your personal lives. Like the music that you love and you consume, it makes you in a way. And so the opportunity to as a fan to be there and communicate with your artist, the music that you love, and the people that are making the music that you love, like you're way more in tune with that than you would be to like fill out an IKEA survey. So like the friction isn't even there, so it's just really a big missed opportunity if you're not communicating with your fans. And Ed, I think you said it well. Like the whole topic of this episode was like how to talk to your fans online and how to actually do it. But I think like when and why is also equally important here, because there's a lot of misconceptions and just a lot of myths out there about how you should be doing it and why it matters and why it's so important.
I've got one more thing that I'm thinking about. It's like I'm super comfortable talking, to people in general. That's just kind of my personality. You guys are kind of the same way. I get that sense. But if you're listening and you're like, well, I'm really shy and I don't like talking to people, you don't have to talk in the same way that we're describing. We're like, I said we essentially cold called fans, and we're like, hey, what's going on? You don't have to do that. You can, like Jesse said, be authentic and send your emails, respond to emails, like do what's comfortable. But what matters is that you're trying to talk to people, because that's what ultimately is going to shine through. So just wanted to highlight, don't feel overwhelmed if your form of communication is not some of the things that we've outlined here. You have to find what works for you.
Well, I think that that's a good place kind of to like start winding down this topic. Is just like, Jesse, from your perspective as like someone who coaches a lot of artists through some of these mental challenges, especially that come with talking to fans. I know you go over a lot of this in the training that you spearheaded inside Indiepro, the turning listeners into fans. So if you guys want to check that out, it's inside the Indiepro library. But like going to Ed's point, like if someone's totally new at this and they're hearing all the exciting stuff that we're talking about and they're like, I could never do that. Like that is so overwhelming and not me. Like what are like, not to put you in the hot seat here, but like what are a few just like general starting points that you would give as far as like how to select the stories that you might tell from your day-to-day life, or how to get into the habit of doing this, and then from there how to turn that into consistency?
Sure. I mean, maybe there's two pretty general points I could give that would be generally applicable in many situations, which would be like, consult your music for these ideas first. Like you are open in your music, I'm sure, but in a way, in some way, somewhere along the line in there, somewhere along the creation or lyrically, you have stories about creating your music or writing your music that has this vulnerability baked in. Even if it's like, I write EDM music and it's instrumental, but I'm inspired by, Bach because my dad was a piano player and he taught me about these chord structures that I ended up kind of leaning on, or something like that. There's stories you can mine there that I think is a natural start that obviously connects into what you're selling and what you're, showing off. So I would say mine and source those stories initially from there. I think that'll get a lot of gears turning. And then I would just say, whether or not you're coming out right with stories like that, I think there's a difference between having the door open and having the door open with you also just like inviting people in and saying, hey, you on the street, come in here. I have, brownies. You don't have to be that overwhelming and coaxing people in. Like maybe Ed and I seem like we're more like that, and maybe we are. But having the door open versus having it closed is different and can be modeled just by a matter of voice, just by sending emails at all, or having a friendly tone, or, replying, or saying that if you reply, I will say, hey, if you're curious about anything, let me know. Just being accommodating. And you just model this concept of like, oh, they are an open, approachable person. If they wanted, if they opened access to something further, I could probably go there and be able to do it. Even if you're not coming out right with these stories and this, kind of narrative, just modeling that you would, or you could, or you might is, I think, at the bare minimum, very important.
I love that.
And I think on top of that, to like kind of add to what Jesse just said, as my final point is that, you said, oh yeah, the two of us, we sound like we're kind of coaxing people in the door, and we're really comfortable kind of persuading and talking people into supporting us once we get, their email or whatever. But a couple of weeks ago, I went back and looked through some early emails that I sent and some early, opt-in videos that I did. And they were, compared to today, they made me cringe a little bit because you learn, right? Like, we've been doing this for 4 or 5 years. So today, as we sit here and we're like talking about, oh yeah, here's what we do, here's how we email. I mean, that's 5 years worth of emails that we have trial and errored our way into knowing what works for us. So you got to just pick a starting point and start talking to people and just improve as you go. Pretty much the same thing with all digital marketing, but there's no right way. You just have to let yourself grow into it.
Yeah, that's well said. I mean, like, done is better than perfect as you kind of start to lean into this, like, little by little. Man, this is so good. Jesse, this was so much fun. Thanks so much for taking the time to be vulnerable here too, and like talk about the stuff that you talk about with your fans. Because I know that's, this is a different medium, kind of a little bit of communication inception right now.
That is actually interesting. Yeah, like you as a podcast listener, like I have everything I just said. I have the same obligation in my mind, or natural tendency to be that to you as someone, coming to me for this information.
Yeah, that's so true. Mm-hmm. Well, this was dope and a super, super fun topic to get into. I really dig this stuff. I'd love to see, like, if you guys are listening and you're in any of our Facebook groups, whether it's the Indies group or the Indiepro group, or if you want to shoot us an email with some of the stuff that you're doing to communicate with your fans, we'd certainly love to hear it. I mean, like, I get inspired by the indies that I see all the time. That's why I stay on Jesse's list. That's why I stay on the 502's list. I'm not just there because they're my friends. I genuinely enjoy reading what they're doing, and how they're communicating. It certainly gives me a lot of food for thought and just kind of keeps the gears turning in my head about, how to be a more open human being. So we're going to dig in a little bit further on our next episode. I'm really excited to kind of continue this email marketing sort of arc that we're going to be getting into. I can't wait. Super excited. Jesse, thanks again for being here, man.
Dude, thank you. This was such a fun convo. I could go for so much longer.
Yeah, for sure. I'm just super stoked to have had you. It was a blast. Ed, thanks for hanging out as always, man. And Indies, we'll catch you guys next time on Creative Juice. Until then, peace out.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the West Coast?